You can actually die from a broken heart. Now, the condition is called Takatsubo Cardiomyopathy, and it's typically going to affect postmenopausal females more than males, so that means about 55 or older, but it can happen to anyone. Now, the exact mechanism is still mysterious, but it's going to affect this structure of the heart called the left ventricle. And after a really strong emotional event, such as losing a loved one, the ventricle can balloon out, and that can reduce the efficiency and the effectiveness of that left ventricle and its ability to eject blood outside of the heart. And that can create cardiogenic shock, which can actually kill you. This structure right here is called the mammillary body, and then this one is called the fornix. Both play an extremely important role in a type of memory called recollective memory. Recollective memory is your ability to associate dates and times with places and events, which means if these structures get damaged or diseased, that can result in amnesia. As accurately as I possibly can, I want to give you an understanding as to the location and pathway that an IUD or an intrauterine device takes as it's inserted into the uterus, which is what you're looking at right here. So first off, this is a mid-sagittal view of the female pelvic anatomy and reproductive system. You can see the vaginal canal as it's heading over towards the lateral border of the cervix, and then we can also see this right lateral portion of the uterus. Now, what would happen is the IUD would be inserted through the vaginal canal, then go through the opening to the cervix, and head towards the end of the uterus called the fundus. And once it gets there and they then insert it, it's going to fan out into this T-like shape with one side heading towards the right and one side heading towards the left. And then it's going to have like this stocky portion that's going to come back down towards that cervical opening. Then you're going to have some strings that are going to descend out of the cervical opening just a few centimeters into that vaginal canal. Let's take a look at the back of the skull where we will meet a suture called the Lambdoid Suture, and it's going to be traversing from one temporal bone all the way over to the other temporal bone. Now, it's called the Lambdoid Suture because it resembles the Greek letter lambda. Now, it's going to be the connection point between these two parietal bones on the top of the skull as they are going to connect to this giant bone in the back called the occipital bone. This muscle right here is called the pectoralis major, but it's not your only pec muscle. If I reflect it back, you can see this tiny one underneath called the pectoralis minor. But while they're both pec muscles, they're going to do different things at different joints. So the pec major is going to move your shoulder joint, while the pectoralis minor is going to move your scapula or your shoulder blade. This may surprise you, but this is not actually your stomach. These right here are the intestines. Their job is to absorb nutrients and bring it into the bloodstream. Your stomach is actually behind the liver up here in the upper left of your abdomen. So next time you say my stomach hurts, you really should change that to my intestines hurt. If you were to count all of the vertebrae or backbones in your entire vertebral column, you would end up with 33 on average, but that includes the sacrum and the coccyx, which are of course going to be fused later on in life. But you have 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and then 5 fused sacral, and on average about 4 fused coccygeal vertebrae, which adds up to 33 in total. Let's take a look at the gallbladder. So what I'm doing here is I'm lifting the abdominal muscles and scooting the liver and the pylorus of the stomach to the side so you can better see the gallbladder here. Now, the function of the gallbladder is to store bile. Bile is going to be produced in the liver, but stored here in the gallbladder, and bile is essential for the breakdown of fats. You're looking at the posterior or back side of the shoulder blade or shoulder area as well as the arm, but I want to focus on this muscle here called the Triceps Brachii. Now, the reason we call it triceps is because it has 3 different heads. And you can see if I kind of move deltoid out of the way that there is a fissure here. There is a separation, and that's showing you the long head of Triceps Brachii coming all the way up to the scapula, the lateral head of Triceps Brachii, and then this one can be a little difficult to see, but there's another head kind of wrapping its way around, and we call that the medial head. But the function of the triceps muscle is going to be to actually bring the entire shoulder into extension or bringing it back to the back side of your body, and it does the exact same thing for the elbow. I have gotten a ton of requests to talk about the injury to the Dallas Cowboy quarterback Dak Prescott. So what I want to do is, using the real human skeleton, show you what likely happened. Again, they haven't given us a ton of detail as to the exact specifics of the injury, but what they have given us, I should be able to give you some kind of idea as to what happened to his ankle and why that's such a severe injury. So all we know is that he suffered a compound fracture and a dislocated ankle. So the dislocation likely came as his foot rotated in this lateral or external direction, but the compound fracture likely came when either the talus, which is this bone that I'm touching right here with my finger, ran into this portion of the fibula called the lateral malleolus, or as it rotated, it also could have hit this portion on the tibia called the medial malleolus. So either of these could have broken off and ripped through the skin, which is what we call a compound fracture. At the same time, it also could have broken the talus bone, or maybe even others that we're just not aware of, as well as ripping all the various ligaments attaching the tibia to the talus. So first, let's go ahead and orient you so you know what you're looking at. This is the tongue right here. This is going to be the epiglottis blocking off that airway, which makes this entire area the pharynx, or the throat, which makes this upper portion the nasopharynx. And in that nasopharynx, you're going to see this hole right here that I'm sticking the probe in. That's the hole to the auditory tube, which is going to connect that nasopharynx to your middle ear. And these new salivary glands are going to border this opening and then travel vertically down the nasopharynx. But there's nothing for me to really show you, simply because the salivary glands are embedded inside of the tissues of that pharynx, which is one reason why they've eluded anatomists for so long. But it's a very interesting discovery, but we need a little more data before we can really say definitively that it's its own new structure and not just belonging to the many countless tiny salivary glands that anatomists have already known that exist in this area. While it may seem like I'm touching the surface of the brain, I'm actually touching one of 3 different meningeal layers called the arachnoid mater. Just below this one is a very thin one called the pia mater, and then I've removed one that would be on top of it called the dura mater. And as I slip my probe underneath here and pull up, you can see these meningeal layers as they have collapsed onto the surface of the brain. The cerebrum, which is this highly coiled area of the brain you're looking at here, is going to have 4 primary areas. The first being the frontal lobe, which is going to be located obviously in that frontal area. And this is going to process things like your personality and empathy and rational decision making. Back here you have the parietal lobe, and this is going to bring in a lot of incoming information coming from the skin, for instance. So when you touch the lips or your elbow, that's going to be processed in this area. Back here we have the occipital lobe, which is going to bring in a lot of visual impulses. So this is where you're going to be processing sight and vision. And then over here we have the temporal lobe, and this is going to bring in auditory or sound sensations. While there are multiple different types of the condition known as spina bifida, what they all have in common is a failure in the fusion of the backbones or the vertebrae. You see that metal rod? You can go ahead and pretend that that's the spinal cord, because that's the exact location the spinal cord would have as it would travel up and down your vertebral column. See, that's one of the jobs of the vertebral column, is to protect the spinal cord. But if you have a failure in the fusion of these bones, the spinal cord itself can start to drift out in at least the most severe case of spina bifida. And that can come with a variety of symptoms, including bladder and bowel issues, and possibly even paralysis. If you had to guess, just how long do you think the entire human digestive tract is from point A all the way to point B? Well, if you guessed that it's somewhere around 20 feet, you would be correct. It's all going to start right about here. This is where your mouth would be. You're looking at the back of the tongue, and then that's going to transition into the esophagus or your food tube, which will then connect to the stomach, which is going to store that digestive material, bathe it in acid, and then slowly start releasing it into the small intestine. Now, they're called the small intestine not because of length, but because of diameter, at least when compared to the large intestine, but this is where most of your nutrients are going to be absorbed into your bloodstream. And then we finally make it to the large intestine, also known as the colon. This is where you're going to store feces, and then absorb water and salt, and then we finally make it to the outside world. That's one seriously long tube. This may seem strange, but this is actually the heart. Now, it's covered in a connective tissue layer called the pericardium, and if I go ahead and remove that, you can see the heart itself. Now, between the heart and that pericardium would normally be a fluid that would bathe the heart, and you can actually see inside of that pericardial cavity, and that would reduce the friction as the heart beats in the chest against other structures in your chest, such as the lungs. Chiari malformation is when you have an abnormally formed cerebellum or possibly an abnormally formed skull, specifically down here at the base in this opening called the foramen magnum. That's where the brainstem and the spinal cord are going to exit your skull and then go down your neck and back. But let's say the issue is with the cerebellum. It would be specific to this spot right here called a cerebellar tonsil. This can get to be too long, and if it gets to be too long, it starts to come out the foramen magnum and puts pressure on the brainstem and that spinal cord right here. And that can also cause a blockage of cerebrospinal fluid, which is a fluid created in the brain, but is going to exit and start to bathe the spinal cord. But that blockage can cause immense headaches. At the same time, the pressure that's put on the brainstem can cause all sorts of motor issues, such as difficulty swallowing, breathing, and an inability to lift things. Did you know that a cubic inch of bone, that's an inch this way, and this way, is capable of supporting somewhere around 19,000 pounds. But before you go and apply 19,000 pounds to your skeleton or any bone in particular, several factors can influence when a bone breaks, such as the overall age and health of the individual, how much soft tissue is around the bone, and how quickly the bone is hit.
Let's take a look inside of the cranial cavity where you're going to notice a bunch of different holes and tunnels distributed throughout the skull. These are all normal. These are called foramini, or foramen for singular. Well, not all of them. I mean, that's actually damage that's accumulated over the years, but the rest of them are pretty much normal. And see this big one right here? It's actually called the foramen magnum, which means big hole, and that's where the spinal cord is going to exit and go down into your axial skeleton. But over here, you can also see my finger kind of bouncing on this one. That's called the jugular foramen, and that's where a few different cranial nerves are going to go through. And then that one, that's called the internal acoustic meatus, and that's going to be where your vestibulocochlear nerve is traveling. Each of them are going to have their own purpose.
Your skull is made up of 22 different bones that all have come together to form this giant mass of tissue. And on top of that, if you include the tiny little ossicles located inside of your middle ear, you have 28 bones in this area alone. You're looking at scar tissue from an Achilles tendon injury. Now, if you take a look down at the rest of the Achilles tendon, you're going to see collagen proteins all going in one direction. And on this side, you can even see them running into and then, blending with the muscle tissue itself. But that's not the case over here. And we didn't know that this was here until we started performing the dissection process. And all the integumentary system, or skin, was completely adhered to this scar. Your teeth are not actually made of bone tissue. While teeth are similar to bones in the fact that they share a lot of similar minerals, they're missing a very important protein called collagen. And then on top of that, teeth are not capable of healing themselves, which is why if you experience damage to your teeth, it's not growing back. Your spine, or your vertebral column, naturally has a curvature to it from front to back. If it's curving anteriorly, we call that a lordotic curvature. And you can see that here in the cervical spine, or your neck, and then also down here in the lumbar region, or your low back. But if it's curving in the posterior direction, or again towards that back, we call that a kyphotic curvature. And you see that here in your thoracic region, or where your ribs are going to be. And then you also see that once again down here in the sacrum. But what you'll notice is that this cadaver has an exaggerated kyphotic curvature. We call that kyphosis. And that can create many different postural issues and cause many different tissues to suffer the consequences, including these little fibrocartilaginous discs that act to cushion between the two vertebrae. And as you can see, hers have thinned out dramatically, showing that this was not a healthy position. Pleural effusion is when you accumulate too much fluid inside of the pleural space, which is the space between the lungs and the rib cage. Now, this normally has fluid, but if you accumulate too much serous fluid, or maybe even blood or pus, that can easily cause life-threatening complications. You actually have a hole in your hip bones. And no, I'm not talking about this right here. I'm talking about this right here. This is called the Obturator Foramen. An obturator gets its root from meaning obstructor. And there's actually going to be a couple muscles that are on either side. And there's going to also be a canal with which blood vessels and a nerve can pass through. I want to show you one of my favorite muscles in the human body, and it's this one right here called Levator Labii Superioris Aliquinase, and that is a mouthful, I know. But as you can see, it's running along the side of the nose and attaching it towards the top of the lip here, but it's going to be able to flare your nostrils a bit, and then it's also going to pick your lips up as though you are snarling. If you go ahead and feel the side of your head and then clench your jaw, you're going to feel a bulging out in this temple area, and that's from this muscle here called temporalis. Temporalis with this muscle here called masseter are very, very important in the process of chewing or mastication, because when they both contract, you are going to elevate that mandible or close your jaw.